Immediately staking a claim in the center, opening diagonals for the queen and bishop, is a dynamic start. Instantly seizing control of the d4 square, this opening creates asymmetric pawn structures, offering dynamic play and strategic complexity from the outset. Immediately vying for central influence and preparing queenside expansion is the idea here. Solidifying central presence, this response prepares for a robust Sicilian defense setup, potentially aiming for pawn breaks to disrupt White's development. Instantly creating a pawn fork threat, White demands immediate attention and disrupts Black's developing harmony. Redirecting the knight to a more robust square, this knight maneuver prepares for kingside development and anticipates potential pawn structure issues. Securing the monarch is paramount, now allowing for more active piece development without immediate king safety concerns. Challenging the bishop's influence, Black aims to provoke White's response and potentially disrupt the pawn structure. Exchanging the bishop here simplifies the position, opening the d-file and potentially weakening Black's pawn structure. Accepting the exchange neatly opens the queen's diagonal, giving Black dynamic piece play. Prying open the center with the pawn offers immediate spatial gains and invites exchanges, potentially simplifying into a position where White's slightly more active pieces can prove decisive. Opening the d-file now forces White to commit their queen, potentially creating weaknesses around their king, as the queenside pawn structure is disrupted and pieces are pushed into more active, but also more exposed, positions. Reclaiming the center with the queen immediately challenges Black's piece development, forcing them to decide whether to contest the open d-file or retreat a piece, thereby gaining White a tempo advantage in the crucial early stages of this Sicilian defense variation. Challenging the central tension immediately forces a decision, creating a dynamic imbalance in the pawn structure and potentially opening lines toward the monarch. A strategic repositioning of the queen, aiming to escape the pawn chain's grip and potentially prepare for a kingside advance, while simultaneously keeping an eye on the queenside development and the central pawn majority. Seeking to prevent immediate NB5 pressure and perhaps create a safe haven for the king later, this pawn advance, while seemingly passive, subtly shifts the kingside pawn structure and signals a desire for a more positional battle rather than an open tactical skirmish. Opening a central pawn corridor, White aims to seize initiative and gain space for their pieces, potentially leading to an attack on Black's kingside by creating dynamic imbalances. Probing the queenside flanks, Black initiates a bold pawn thrust to gain crucial territory and potentially disrupt White's central control, aiming to open lines for the bishop pair and create new attacking avenues while demanding an immediate response. Opening up the c-file offers immediate pressure, and bringing the knight to c3 solidifies control over the central squares while preparing for potential pawn advances on the queenside, aiming to disrupt Black's pawn structure further. Opening a path on the queenside, this pawn advances to challenge White's central pawn structure, embracing the chaos it introduces and forcing a decision regarding the immediate pawn skirmish. Reclaiming the pawn opens lines and challenges Black's central influence, but consider the long-term consequences for your queen's mobility and the potential for Black to exploit the semi-open c-file. Unleashing the knight to f6 injects a welcome dose of activity, aiming to contest the center and prepare for the king's castle while simultaneously eyeing the d5 square as a potential outpost. Developing the bishop here aims to bolster the queenside pawn structure and prepare for further central expansion, while simultaneously offering a subtle invitation for Black to advance their kingside pawns, potentially creating weaknesses. Bringing the bishop to e7 neatly unifies Black's minor pieces, preparing the king for castling and offering a solid defensive shield against any immediate threats along the kingside diagonal, while also potentially opening a path for the rook later. A preventative measure to guard against the bishop's potential harassment on the long diagonal, this pawn advance subtly aims to restrict Black's pieces while shoring up the kingside's safety. Securing the monarch amidst the developing pawn structure establishes a vital defensive sanctuary, preparing for potential challenges on the central files. Ramping up the central pressure with the rook, white aims to activate this piece on the open d-file, potentially supporting a future advance or preparing to contest it should black respond symmetrically. This maneuver subtly builds pressure on black's queenside pawn structure, which is somewhat exposed after the pawn exchanges. It's a classic example of centralizing heavy pieces to exert influence and restrict enemy piece mobility, a foundational principle for gaining positional advantages. Unveiling a subtle counterthrust, black aims to dislodge white's queen from its dominant central perch and simultaneously prepare to contest the semi-open c-file, a potential battlefield for future operations. This maneuver also hints at a possible reallocation of the queen to a more defensive or aggressive square, depending on white's reaction. Strategically consolidating the queen's position, white aims to dislodge black's active knight and secure the central files for potential future advances, while also preparing to contest the now open d-file with renewed vigor. Black immediately activates the rook, contesting the open c-file which white's queen currently occupies, signaling a desire for active counterplay. Asserting dominion over the open c-file, this maneuver by white aims to disrupt black's nascent queenside counterplay and prepare for a potential kingside assault, by clearing the way for further centralization of the queen and supporting an eventual d5 pawn push. Shifting the queen to b7 offers greater control over the c-file, anticipating potential pawn pushes from white's queenside and creating a flexible platform for future maneuvers. Shifting the queen to c2 relinquishes central influence temporarily, but aims to connect the rooks more effectively and potentially launch an assault on the queenside, preparing for future pawn advances or pressure along the c-file. Instigating a pawn sacrifice to seize initiative, black's bishop maneuvers to an aggressive diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and create opportunities for counterplay. Initiating a knight maneuver, white repositions this piece to d2, preparing for a potential central expansion or a flank attack, while simultaneously reinforcing the e4 pawn and clearing the way for other pieces. Unleashing a pawn thrust into the center, black immediately challenges white's dominant pawn structure and aims to seize a foothold. This aggressive maneuver disrupts white's comfortable development and introduces immediate dynamic possibilities, potentially opening lines for black's pieces or forcing concessions. Unlocking the center, white bravely surrenders the d-pawn to disrupt black's pawn structure and open lines. This bold exchange aims to seize the initiative by creating immediate threats, potentially forcing black into a defensive posture. The resulting open files, especially the d-file, will become critical battlegrounds, demanding precise piece placement and active play from both sides. White hopes to exploit any weaknesses that arise from black's altered pawn formation, perhaps targeting the kingside or seeking opportunities for tactical skirmishes. It's a calculated risk, trading material for dynamic compensation and a chance to dictate the game's tempo. A daring plunge into the center. Black boldly grabs the pawn, unbalancing white's central structure and immediately contesting the open d-file. This aggressive pawn grab throws a wrench into white's carefully constructed queenside pawn chain and opens up lines for black's pieces, particularly the queen and the remaining knight. While it creates immediate tension and demands precise calculation from white, it also potentially exposes black's king if white can exploit the resulting pawn weaknesses. Shifting the queen to the queenside opens a diagonal for potential pressure against black's slightly exposed king, while simultaneously preparing to contest the crucial c-file. Shattering the queen's defense, this move severs white's control over the c-file and introduces a dynamic imbalance, forcing a reshuffle of white's forces as the queen vacates its central post. Exchanging queens here simplifies the position, aiming for a more manageable endgame where white might exploit their slight lead in development and potential central pawn advantage. Suddenly, the board's geometry opens up as that knight swoops in, creating an immediate pin and forcing the white queen to abandon its post. Black seizes this moment to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially exploit the newly formed open files, aiming to activate the rooks and put pressure on the now somewhat exposed white king. Relocating the monarch to f1, a subtle but crucial repositioning, grants the king a more secure haven from the immediate storm brewing on the e-file, and anticipates potential future threats originating from the queen side. Reclaiming the piece ushers in a structural adjustment. The doubled pawns on the file present an intriguing target for white, but black now possesses a more robust central presence, potentially enabling pawn pushes later. The king's premature excursion to the center, while ostensibly avoiding immediate checks, immediately exposes it to the relentless pressure of black's advanced pieces, particularly the rook on the open c-file and the knight poised for a disruptive sortie. This necessitates a frantic repositioning of white's remaining forces to shore up the king's safety and prevent a swift collapse of the defensive structure. A bold gambit opens up the board, sacrificing material for immediate initiative and hoping to exploit the exposed white king in the ensuing melee. Reclaiming central space and threatening to disrupt black's pawn structure, this knight repositioning aims to exploit the newly opened lines and potentially pressure the weakened king's side. Black seeks to exploit the newly opened diagonal for the bishop, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances on the king side. A calculated risk to seize control of the c-file and pressure black's isolated pawns. A bold exchange, sacrificing a piece to activate the rook and open a critical diagonal, forcing white to confront immediate tactical threats and a potential king safety issue. The rook now claims the open file, an essential step in preparing to exploit the exposed black king and pressure weak pawns down the line. Bringing the rook to the d-file forces white to confront the newly established open line, potentially creating immediate tactical complications or initiating a positional duel for control of this crucial avenue of attack. Reclaiming the open file after a decisive pawn sacrifice offers immediate counterplay and frees the rook for active defense or potential counterattack. Sacrificing the bishop on h3 gambits the pawn structure for active counterplay against white's uncastled king, hoping to disrupt white's coordination and potentially exploit the weakened king's defense. Seizing the open file decisively, this exchange initiates a simplified endgame where white's extra pawn on the king side will become a significant factor. Black's sacrifice of the bishop for the knight, while creating immediate tactical complications, has left their structure somewhat exposed, particularly on the weakened king side. Accepting the rook exchange now simplifies the position, steering towards an endgame where black's passed pawn on the queen side offers significant counterplay, while white's king is exposed, and their knight on g2 will likely be a nuisance. A bold maneuver aiming to seize the initiative in the now open d-file, though it leaves the knight vulnerable to potential harassment if black can mobilize their pawns. Unveiling a subtle plan to regroup, black aims to shift the bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially eyeing central influence or preparing for future pawn advances on the queen side, all while maintaining a defensive posture against the opponent's knight. Repositioning the knight to c3 aims to reinforce the central pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances on the king side, while simultaneously preparing for a more active role in a potential endgame should pieces continue to be exchanged. Unleashing the f-pawn is a bold attempt to disrupt white's otherwise tidy pawn structure and potentially create counterplay on the king side, but it leaves black's king with a slightly more exposed posture.